how can I trust anything that came out of the West when there is an active genocide that is being funded by the West in Palestine? And how can I not trust that I am next?
There is a colonial aspect here. Because end of the day, we all sort of look at liberalism or the Western model as something that we didn't produce ourselves. And particularly when its values look to us to be completely at odds with what it preaches, then it becomes even more difficult to accept it.
Welcome to our Doha Debates Town Hall. I'm your host, Femi Oke. We're here in Doha in partnership with the Doha Forum to explore the fundamental values shaping civilization and to ask what ideas and philosophies can help us build a better global order. On stage, we have students and recent graduates from across campuses in Doha who will help guide our conversation. And we're also joined by three expert guests. Victor Gao is Chair Professor at Suzhou University and Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization. Hina Khar is a diplomat who served as Pakistan's 26th Foreign Minister. Vali Nasr is a professor of international affairs and Middle East studies at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced and International Studies. Welcome, guests. So good to have you. Today, the global liberal order faces challenges from shifting power and ongoing conflicts around the world. The re-election of US President Donald Trump also raises questions about the future of American leadership abroad. If the US steps back from its traditional role, who and what will fill that vacuum? Our debate will focus on the competing values and principles that underpin our societies. Values like individualism versus collectivism, tradition versus modernity, and freedom versus order. We hope that this conversation will uncover fundamental truths about which building blocks are most essential to creating a better, more peaceful world. But first, let's take a look at how some of these values have taken shape across the world. In the Arabian Peninsula in the early 600s, the Prophet Muhammad received revelations which became the basis of Islam. Islam means submission to the will of God. The Islamic Empire centered on the Caliphate, a pioneering form of governance that combined religion, law, and political power. Caliphs, or successors of the Prophet, were guided by the Sharia, a legal tradition derived from the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad's teachings. Today, most Muslim-majority countries have mixed legal systems that combine traditional religious and civil law. In China, Confucianism has been a dominant philosophy for 2,000 years. Confucius, a philosopher born in 551 BCE, drew on centuries of ritualistic concepts to address the instabilities of his time, creating a worldview that fostered social harmony. In pursuit of this harmony, Confucianism valorizes filial piety, or shao, which means devotion to elders and family, and by extension, to rulers and the state. Chinese President Xi Jinping has publicly extolled these Confucian virtues, calling them the cultural soil that nourishes the Chinese people. He's also interpreted this deference to authority as a way to restructure decision-making processes and centralize state power. Today, the China model combines a traditionally strong state-led economy with new freedoms for private entrepreneurs. For millennia, the Indian subcontinent has been a highly diverse region across languages, faiths, and schools of thought. In India, this long-standing diversity has led to a strong commitment to pluralism, whether cultural, religious, or philosophical. Today, India is the world's largest democracy, with pluralism written into its constitution. In neighboring Pakistan and Bangladesh, diversity and the desire for democracy remain just as strong. In the West, liberalism emerged in the 17th century, drawing largely on ancient Greek ideas of democracy, which translates to the rule of the people. Philosopher John Locke argued that authority to rule comes not from divine right, but from the consent of the governed, and that individualism is sacrosanct. The American and French revolutions marked a shift from traditional feudalism and monarchies to the liberal democracies that are still the predominant form of government in the West. These societies place emphasis on private property, the commodification of labor, and social mobility. Political ideologies are a product of circumstance and a manifestation of our morals. And as our world evolves, so do our political systems. Across the globe, new and alternate visions are emerging. Looking to the future, what kind of world do we want to create? And what are the ideas that will get us there? Time to hear from our speakers. Victor, I'm going to start with you. What does China get right in terms of core principles that the rest of the world can learn from China?
Thank you very much, Fema. It's a great honor for me to be here, and greetings to the distinguished audience as well as the other panelists, and equally, if not more importantly, to the distinguished students on the stage. First of all, I think the world we are living in is a multipolar world. If anyone says they want to go back to the unipolar world, it's a mission impossible. For the past 46 years, China has been building socialism with Chinese characteristics. I would say the more important thing are the characteristics. So what are these characteristics? This is really a million-dollar question. I would say for the past 4 decades or so, China has been put a premium on development. Deng Xiaoping said, development is the hard truth. We believe every country needs to develop, and no country should be complacent. No country should rest on its own laurel or even try to throw a wedge in other countries' development. So stability is very much of an asset, and keeping peace in the world is very much important, and also pushing for free trade and market practice of all kinds should be very important. When we look around the world, China always emphasizes the importance of connectivity, infrastructure. Why? Because we benefited from this. In China, we have a saying, if you want to be rich, build a road. That's why China builds, whereas several other countries are not in the building mode. They probably want to destroy. So I think the choice is very clear. Let's really put a focus on development, stability, peace, and always believe in development as the hard truth and the softer truth and the smart truth. Thank you.
Vali, we're exploring different philosophies, different ideas for a better global order. Is liberalism still the best option that we have right now?
Well, let me also begin by thanking the Doha Forum for inviting me here. It's great to be with my co-panelists, with the students, and with the audience. The issue of whether liberalism is the best form of system is contentious, particularly nowadays. But it's important to note that, first of all, what do we mean by liberalism? It's a system of values which particularly is associated with secularism, with individual rights, with certain legal norms that governs international order. It is a political system which we associate with democracy and the people choosing their governments. And then it's also an economic system which is based on market system. The three of these things are essentially what we know as liberalism. There is no doubt that liberalism has contributed greatly to technological and economic advancement around the world. I mean, some of the most prosperous and technologically advanced systems over history have been associated with liberalism. But digging deeper, there is no one practice of liberalism. There are different systems. Even when we think about democracy, there are different models. There are different versions of economic liberalism, of market practice. And many of these are now confronting serious challenges. Even in the home of liberalism, in Europe, the United States, we see certain rebellion against the principles of liberalism. And then in the global south, there is also a great deal of skepticism about very many aspects of liberalism, including its moral values as well. And in fact, I think we're in an era where people want to pick and choose rather than accepting liberalism as a whole as the best system. But I would say it's very relevant. Even if we bounce against it, it remains a very powerful principle in global order.
Hina, you come to this conversation from a different perspective as a diplomat, a former foreign minister of Pakistan. If we're talking about priorities the global order should embrace, what would they be?
Okay, so first of all, pleasure to be here, and pleasure to be here with the co-panelists, the students. This is new for all of us, and I'm looking forward to that. I think it's really less of a different perspective because of my geography or history, and perhaps more of a different perspective because I am a practitioner. Whatever I've learned is from having seen foreign policy, values, and orders play out in the real world, right? And I think from my vantage point, I would debate less about what are important values or what principles must we hold, and more about what is the lowest common denominator or what values and legal system or parts of the international order are at a level that we will not dispute and will actually apply them without exceptionalism to everyone. I think what you see in the world today, the disorder that you're seeing in the world, is because of the lack of universal application of what we consider to be good enough or high enough or important enough to go to war for. So what you see happening in Palestine, I think, is creating a lot of a lack of credibility of the order as it exists. So lack of exceptionalism, I would say, the universality of whatever we consider to be the value system or the principles that we hold. And I would say that if nothing else, let's agree that at least the whole world may want to agree that the right to life is one thing which is non-negotiable. And I think what you're seeing play out in the world is that right of life itself is now becoming negotiable.
Let's unpack the values that underpin how we govern ourselves. So Victor, you gave us some insight into the China model. From the way you described how China sees itself and the rest of the world, what ideas could we, or do you think China could export globally?
Well, I don't think China has the truth. Truth is always relative. Some truth works for you, but it may not work for others. I think from the Chinese perspective, several things really are very important. One is that without democracy, there will be no modernization. So China does not oppose democracy. China advocates democracy. But then on the other hand, democracy has no set model. You need to adapt the democracy to your own national circumstances and come up with your own unique system. Now, secondly, we hear a lot about human rights. Human rights are so important, but I think from the Chinese perspective, human rights do not exist in a vacuum. Human rights need to be balanced with human obligations. You cannot talk about human rights without equally talking about human obligations. Therefore, I think the Chinese perspective is more balanced, is more all-inclusive, rather than one-sided. For example, in this August hall, I cannot cry fire. That's not an exercise of my freedom of speech. It's actually a violation of law. If my cry results in stampede, for example. Therefore, I think when we talk about all these things, we need to be very careful as to what these labels really mean. Very quickly, the United Kingdom for many hundred years didn't have a Supreme Court. The EU, during its periodic review, found that deficiency, and EU ordered the United Kingdom to set up the Supreme Court. That's why if you go to London, go to the Westminster Square, on the west side of the square, there is a Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. Why? Because United Kingdom built the empire, declined from the empire without a Supreme Court, while Britain had always talked about the balance of power. We need to really know what all these labels are really about, and whether you are really delivering and walking the walk while you talk the talk. I think we all need to find a way to serve the fundamental interest of our own people rather than being lectured upon by others and having other values being imposed on our own country. Thank you.
What's fascinating about some of the diplomatic work that you do as you travel around the world, people will not necessarily ask about Pakistan. They will ask about China.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
Through fear or interest or curiosity or jealousy, what?
I think we're living in a world where everybody is collectively going through a process of feeling overly threatened by the other. And we're living in a world where we have normalized dividing the world back into two spheres. Okay, and what divided the world back into two spheres in the Cold War or prior to that was two different ideologies, right? And then we came to the end of history moment and we thought, oh, everybody's going to live happily ever after because everybody's going to follow exactly the same model to get the gains that the West had gotten. Now, suddenly, you have the emergence of a country which has followed a pretty much similar but also different its own journey and has been able to deliver the goods which were only possible, we were told, until then, through the liberal world order and in a certain way, democracy in a certain way, economics in a certain way, human life, human dignity being seen in a certain way, the contract between the state and the people being in a certain way. Now suddenly you have a country which has delivered the most people out of poverty, but it has followed its own journey. Before that, you had these Asian tigers. You had countries like Pakistan and India, which had done reasonably well, followed the British parliamentary system. Some had adopted the presidential system of the US. Suddenly, you have a country which has done it differently. Okay? And now we are all feeling very threatened. Okay? And then I think this threat perception is anti-human development and looking at the world as us. And this whole, whether you call it decoupling or de-risking, however you define it, it is taking a toll on countries like ours and all over the world because everybody's asked, who do you choose? And we say we choose our own country. We choose our own nation. We choose Pakistan. So whenever I'm asked, who are you choosing? Which side are you going to be on? I say I'm on Pakistan's side. That should be good enough.
Let's share the conversation.
This is Dr. Fatma. I'm from a recent graduate from Qatar University College of Pharmacy. My question is to all the panelists, and it is more related to the religious rights that everyone has as human beings. Do you think that religion acts as a catalyst or a barrier when it comes to promoting this global order that we're trying to promote? Or do you think that there's another way that we can have both at the same time?
Vali, this question has your name all over it.
Well, that actually goes to the heart of the debate. I mean, we often talk about liberalism as Western liberalism, which already sort of suggests that we don't see liberalism as a value that is somehow true of the whole world, but is actually associated with the West. Which is correct, which means that liberalism came out of Western history. It's natural to Western history. And it therefore has to do with culture, geography, religion of the West. And then it's an idea that is being exported elsewhere. And given also colonial legacies of the West with the rest of the world, this makes it much more contentious. So it's an interesting question. Can other religions coexist with a set of ideas that was born out of a Christian experience? And then the question is, do you need to absorb the whole of liberalism as a whole? Or can other religions coexist with certain parts of liberalism? For instance, can you coexist with market economy but not with democracy? Can you coexist with democracy but not with universal human values as it's defined in the West? I think we have been for some time, at least in the Muslim world, really negotiating with this. And I think even to Victor's point, so has China been. I mean, it has done very well with maybe market economics, maybe less so with democracy, but it's very much holding on to its own set of value systems that comes from its own history.
Right, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Rod. I'm a fourth-year student at Georgetown, and I want to really expand the discussion further. So, Mr. Gao, you talked a lot about development and how that's a priority for the Chinese government. However, we should move a bit further than just development. What makes successful societies is not just development, but it's merit. The idea that someone can get ahead because they're qualified and they're really good at what they do, and not because of their family or their religion or their tribe. And I believe that the most successful societies, which has been, for example, the United States, have succeeded in comparison to other countries because of that system. Because in the United States, you can get further ahead than if you were in other countries because of your merit. And I just want to really ask you that in China, there's also a big culture on merit. However, it's very top down and there's a lot of authoritarianism in China. We've seen the past 5 years, Xi Jinping has consolidated power significantly within his own office. And in many ways, the meritocracy of the past 30 years seems to be collapsing. The Chinese economy has not developed as much as it should have since post-COVID. So how can you really address those things while ignoring the rights of the individual as is taken in the West, for example?
Thank you very much. I think you are raising a very important question. Without going too much into history, I think China started to decline as a result of the First Opium War, intensified by the Second Opium War and the 1900 incident in China involving 8 countries kind of sending troops to China. And for the last 100 years or so, China experimented with all kinds of models of development. Empire, constitutional monarchy, republic, warlords, for example, revolution of all kinds. Eventually, I think, China figured out a way that China need to go onto its own path. And then before 1978, when Deng Xiaoping bounced back to become the paramount leader, China was engaged in probably the most intensive splitting of the ideological hair. China was locked up in a big box, believing that socialism must be good, must be better than capitalism. But then Deng Xiaoping realized that socialism, that practiced by China, did not bring bread and butter to the table. People were hungry, poverty. By 1978, China probably achieved the highest level of egalitarianism in human history. Everyone was equal, but everyone was equally poor. Let me tell this distinguished audience, there is no fun of being locked up in poverty. And China's mission was to find a way to maintain its political system, which is unique, because Chinese history is unique, but also figure out a way to bring bread and butter to the table, to make sure that China will achieve development. That is why China's roadmap is clear. It's different from anyone else. Whatever China has been doing over the past 46 years may not be able to be done by any other country. But the key commonality is simple. That is, bring your people, uplift your people out of poverty, build roads, set up factories, push the edge of science and technology, and be a leading force for peace and stability. I think in this overall context, individuals will always be important. China could not have achieved all this miraculous transformation of itself if China did not empower the people, enable the people. But the way the Chinese people have been empowered and enabled are different. We always talk about the collectiveness of the Chinese nation, together with the individual rights of each person. We always put a premium on family. In China, family is always important. And we refuse to be dictated by other countries when they want to redefine gender, when they want to redefine family. No. We believe the Chinese values are deeply rooted, Victor, dating back 5,000 years. We cannot be dictated by other countries. Thank you.
The point you're making is a perfect point for me to bring in a Russian philosopher, Alexander Dugin, who is a well-known critic of Western liberalism. Have a listen to what he says. And then, Hina, I'd love for you to come off the back of Dugin with your thoughts too. Let's have a listen.
Everything started with individualism. And that is precisely what is wrong in all this process. That is a kind of nominalistic, atomistic understanding of the being and abandoning of all kind of collective identity, traditional identity, new collective identity, traditional religious collective identity, individualism. worked through all last centuries of the Western and human history in order to liberate individual from any kind of collective identity.
That idea of individualism being quite destructive, where Pakistan is navigating between colonialist background, some Western liberal values in there, but also a tradition that goes back so many years. How is there a balancing act that you have to do there?
I think every country, look, what we're suffering from right now is the world is unable to, or unwanting to almost, do the balancing act. Okay, so the world population, if you were to divide it in broad terms, 20% of the world population lives in what we call the Western Hemisphere, right? The rest of the 80% of the population lives in the non-Western world, okay? So are we saying that the journey of the 20% must be exactly emulated by the rest of the 80% to achieve their... What if that 20% had a different journey to have... I'm just asking this question, right? What if they had a different journey which had reached them with these goods? Then would we be emulating that? And I believe very, very strongly that liberalism has lost its path in terms of... To me, liberalism, not to me, but I think theoretically, is the ability to live with diversity, to give everyone the space to exist without being dogmatic about which religion you can follow, what you can wear, how you must dress up, how you must act, what business you can do, what not. That's what liberalism is in the individual space. When we take liberalism out of the individual space and take it to the space of governance as state, now liberalism seems to have become very, very dogmatic, which is saying there must be no diversity. This is the only way, or you will perish. We're seeing evidence that countries do not perish if they do not follow exactly an identical model. So this urge to have everybody become a reflection of you is having disastrous impact. And eventually, it seems like the fight is not for which order. And let's allow me to say this. I think I agree with what Victor said, that if any country, whatever model that they're following, if people are not at the heart of what the country seeks to develop and prosper, then that country will perish eventually, or its governance structure. But if people are at its heart, then I think you have a good case.
Lina.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, dear guests, for attending. I'm Lina Darwish. I'm a graduate from Georgetown University, class of 2023. I'm asking all of the panelists in discussion of liberalism. Mr. Nasr, you said liberalism came from the West. How can I trust anything that came out of the West when there is an active genocide that is being funded by the West in Palestine? And how can I not trust that I am next? Very frankly.
I fully understand your sentiment, and that's actually is at this particular point in time what has happened in Gaza is a major challenge to at least that aspect of liberalism that I mentioned, which is about its values and its application in a universal sense, about holding all countries to the same standard and valuing, as Hina said, life of all people equally. But there are other aspects to liberalism as well, which is about how a society governs itself. It's not just about what comes from the West or what West preaches, which, to your point, the issue is we think about liberalism sometimes as a model of government that comes from the outside. In other words, which kind of a government is better suited to promoting economic development, prosperity, etc., or which form of government is more efficient in terms of stability. And I think every country is negotiating these all the time. Partly it is that, we talk about countries or regions as if there's everybody in a country thinks the same way. If you listen to Alexander Dogan, you would think that all Russians think like him, but they don't. We are also conflicted within our own societies. Everywhere you go, you look at Arab countries, there are people who believe 100% in Western liberalism and people who reject it, people who want to pick and choose going forward. And I think it's a continuous process of negotiation. But to your point and this gentleman's point, there is a colonial aspect here. Because end of the day, we all sort of look at liberalism or the Western model as something that we didn't produce ourselves, that is being that we are importing and sometimes is being forced on us. And particularly when its values look to us to be completely at odds with what it preaches, and its values and system is seen to be used against us, then it becomes even more difficult to accept it.
Stan, I know you had a quick thought. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Stan. I'm a student at Carnegie Mellon University, and I think it's a really interesting discussion when we discuss alternatives to the liberalism we've seen at the West. I do think when we look back at history, one of the benefits of this Western liberalism, however, has been the ability for incredible individuals to engage in deep structural change. Someone like Elon Musk can start SpaceX. 10 years ago, Americans were buying Russian rockets. Given the current Ukraine crisis, that's actually quite embarrassing. And in 10 years, he can engage in a deep structural change. If we're not going to have this Western liberalism, how are we going to allow deep structural change in this way? Particularly in sectors where being second place just doesn't matter. Perhaps China can be the second best in space, which it is. It can be the second cheapest in payload into space. They can be the second best in AI. But in some sectors like this, second place doesn't matter. How do we address that? Thank you.
Vali, then Hina, but briefly.
I mean, I fully understand, but I want to sort of throw it back at you and other students. Yes, Elon Musk and Silicon Valley represent a tremendous amount of possibility to do major changes. But the United States also is completely incapable of many other structural changes. We cannot build a national railway system. We cannot modernize our cities. We cannot have universal healthcare for people. Our parliament or Congress is completely dysfunctional. Many Americans think, the presidential elections, rightly or wrongly, does not reflect their vote. So in other words, it's not a given that liberalism in all aspects works all the time. I think my sort of question to you is how do we pick and choose, right? How do you have Elon Musk? But also, on the other hand, can liberalism survive in a country where, one individual can be worth $50-60 billion and his pay package, which was actually rejected, is in contention, is $56 billion. And then you also have abject poverty, sometimes along racial lines in that very same society.
Stan, which question did you like best that Vali posed to you?
That's a very good rebuttal. I am very sympathetic to the argument that Elon Musk can land a rocket with chopsticks, but people still live in serious poverty. I think that's a very good question to pose back.
Hina, go ahead.
Yeah, very quickly. I think the question is less about whether economic liberal order sort of works or not. I think the jury is not out there on that one. I think China's progress also had liberal economic policies which led to the progress. I think the problem with the order that we're trying to propose and saying, a lot of people like to believe that it is autocracies which are threatening the rules-based system, whereas what is actually threatening the rules-based order or the system or the liberal order is the lack of consistency and exceptionalism that is being presented by democracies and holders and preservers and propagators of the liberal world order by not showing to you and me that they hold their friends to the same test as they hold to their enemies to. And within that, the weaponization of the human rights machinery and the trades machinery and economic sanctions has played a big role in creating huge credibility gaps, which are reflected in questions about Palestinian genocide and being a propagator of more military assistance to that. This is what is creating questions that we're asking in this debate today.
I'm going to move on to bringing something, Hina, that you mentioned, and also, Lina, that you mentioned as well, which is genocide. I'm going to play a little clip from Islamic scholar Wael Halak, who has some fundamentally interesting ideas about nation state and what it is capable of. Let's take a look.
The state is not just a natural phenomenon that ever grew up or grew out of the human experience on the whole. It is a specific European entity that has specific European tools that were universalized through colonialism in the 19th century, effectively. And so if that is the case, then Muslims, if they want to develop a state now under the hegemony of the state, they cannot have a state that is different than the state that exists today. And that the state that exists today is entirely, in my opinion, anti-Islamic. It perpetuates all the values that are not Islamic. It is literally merciless in so many ways. It is destructive. Potentially every state is a genocidal state. Every state is a genocidal state, potentially. In other words, if a state doesn't commit genocide, it is because it did not exploit its full potential.
Every state is a genocidal state, potentially. Victor, you start.
I beg to disagree with this. First of all, we have about 200 countries in the world of today, many of which are nation states. For example, the United States is not a nation state. It's a melting pot, drawing people from all corners of the world. China itself is a country composed of 56 different nationalities. And but you can really find some countries which you may say, well, this fits the criteria of a nation state. I would say, for example, Norway today or Iceland today, they are very homogeneous people over there. However, I think the fact that we have about 200 countries in the world and 193 members of the United Nations do speak about something common in the world of today. The world is organized by countries, and if you qualify to be a member of the United Nations, you have the privilege and the protection of the UN Charter. So we still need to think about the world of today in terms of these countries, and each country is different.
Is every state potentially
I don't think so.
You said you disagree. Just because you disagree.
I disagree.
Let's bring in some.
I think China will never be a
voices.
genocidal country. That's
Sure.
my firm conviction.
Go ahead.
So first of all, I welcome everyone here. My name is Hussein, and I'm from Qatar University. And regarding the video that was just played, the thing about China is the one China model that China is going with is causing a lot of issues in terms of religious basis and social injustices. So how do you actually try to tackle that within the one China model that you're having, in addition to the threats that are to the neighboring countries as well? Thank you.
Allow me to be very brief. I think we in China are very proud of all the achievements, politically and economically speaking. However, I personally believe the China roadmap may work for China. It may not work for any other country, because every country needs to figure out its own special circumstances and adapt whatever model to suit your own circumstances. If anyone comes to you and say, I have the truth, I have the only truth, I have the total truth, don't believe in that country. Don't believe in that system. Because whatever truth he may have, you need to adapt it to your family circumstance, to your national circumstance, and come up with
Victor,
your own unique
I believe
roadmap.
the truth that you are going to keep it brief.
Thank you.
Bagro, thank you.
That's
Middle.
the absolute truth.
Hi, my name is Hiba, and I graduated from HBKU. So I'm not going to get, I fully agree with Wael Halak's point. I'm not going to get into Western hypocrisy and genocidal nature because it's already on full display. But for China, I'm Syrian, and China has already vetoed like 10 UN resolutions on Syria, including ones for basic food and medicine to cross the border. And ones were drafted by Arab states, not like a US conspiracy, but China still blocked it. And, you know, you then pretend to be non-interventionist and very like neutral and clean in the MENA region. Sure, I'm not going to focus on Syria and myself, though. I want to talk about my Uyghur friends, whom I've known for so long. They are my friends. They have no interest in lying to me, and they have not been able to contact their families or hear from them for years now. And, you know, you can call them like terrorists, criminals, separatists, whatever. And I'll concede to that, even though, by the way, this is the exact same war and terror narrative that you criticize the West for. You say the West is Islamophobic, which it is. It used this narrative to invade Iraq and Afghanistan and destroy the region. But then you use the exact same narrative on another group of Muslims, the Uyghur Muslims. So, but again, I'll concede to the idea that somehow the parents of my loveliest, most humble, nicest friends are all criminals and terrorists. Do they not still have the basic right of fair, transparent trial and contact with the outside world and contact with their family just to know if they're alive or not?
First of all, China-Syrian relations are very good, and we are appalled by what's happening in Syria, and we are appalled with a huge outflux of people out of Syria to many other parts of the world. We do hope stability can be restored, and China's way of dealing with any other country, including Syria, is that we deal with that country as it is. If you have a government, you have a president, a prime minister, we deal with the government as it is. We do not interfere in the domestic internal affairs of that country. Therefore, now that Syria has its government and has its head of state, who visited China not long ago and was warmly welcomed, I think this is the Chinese way of dealing with any other country, big or small. If there is a change of government, as it happened to many other countries, China needs to shift gear and deal with that particular president or prime minister. Therefore, I think it's up to the Syrian people to do its best to restore stability and keeping the peace.
Victor, respectfully, the question wasn't really landing on Syria. The question was landing on your friends who have family in China, who are from the Uyghur community, and they cannot connect with them. It was a very direct question. What is your very direct response?
Let me be very direct. I've been to Xinjiang multiple times. I have many Uyghur brothers and sisters. Uyghur nationality is one of the 56 nationalities in China. In China, we altogether have about 20 different nationalities which are Muslim communities. Now, it is also true that among the Uyghur people, there were some separatists who want to break Xinjiang away from China for their own purposes. Let me assure you, Xinjiang will always remain part of China. China's determination to defend China's sovereignty and territorial integrity is real. No one can shake that. So if anyone wants to say, we want to use the Uyghur issue to break Xinjiang away from China, it's a violation of the Chinese law. It's a mission impossible. It can never be accomplished. And respect for the human rights of everyone, including me, my family, and 56 nationalities is a must for China.
Victor, it was a more personal question than
I conceded that,
Go ahead.
the siblings, parents of my nicest, most humble friends are all terrorists and criminals. I said that. But still, let's consider they're all terrorists and separatists and criminals. Do they still not have the basic right of just free trial, like transparent trial and contact with the outside world? Like, they just want to know if they're alive or not. Do they not have that basic human dignity? Even if they're terrorists,
Let me give you one example. We can engage between ourselves to talk about this in greater depth. I think we have other very important issues to talk about. We are talking about a changing world. We are talking about Mr. Donald Trump becoming the president in about 40 days. We are talking about peace and the stability and war in the world. So let's talk between ourselves for this particular issue you are raising. Thank you.
Vali, you're looking incredibly thoughtful. Articulate your thoughts.
Well, I don't have much to say about this particular issue, but I don't buy necessarily what Wael Hallaq said. Because, first of all, it's one of those statements that you cannot disprove. Every country in the world is a state, whether they were pro-Western, not Western, they all have adopted the notion of a state. And those who don't have a state all want to have a state. That's so. And also I would say that if you looked at history, organized violence is not new. I mean, people in the Middle East remember when the Mongol hordes invaded in the 13th century. There was countries that lost majority of their population in that time period. I think what's at issue is a certain number of protocols that were written in the 20th century to say that the modern post-World War I state is different from the governments in the past. That it was about use of chemical weapons, and then after World War II was about the conventions on genocide, on mass violence. So it's not about state in history. It's really about holding the modern state, and particularly those who were the authors of those protocols, basically hold their feet to fire, based on what is happening, most blatantly in Gaza, and to say that, you were the ones who wrote these laws. These are embedded in the United Nations, where every country is a member of it, and they have to be enforced on everybody. That you cannot, if you're sitting in the West, let's say you criticize China on the Uyghurs, but not raise issues of Palestinian rights, right? That kind of selectivity undermines, if you would, the very basis of it.
Can I just very quickly completely agree with what Vali has said? Because I think at the heart of what is breaking, as far as order, credibility, etc., is the fact that the giving of impunity by choice to countries that you prefer and going full steam ahead with economic sanctions and everything else, and weaponization of the human rights and trade agenda in some ways. And that is now what is fracturing what is order, because people are seeing two different forms of, treatment. You're going to war to protect human rights, and then you're seeing death in large numbers being explained by the right to self-defense. I think that is really at the heart of what is creating the chaos that we see today.
I see all those questions and the responses. I'm going to take all of those questions and enthusiasm onto our next segment, which is about to start now, because one of the most contested ideas in governance is whether certain values like freedom, equality, or democracy should be imposed around the world, or whether it's better that countries develop their own regional forms of governance. Let me start with you, Hina. This idea about there being a way to see the world, which you touched upon just now, but that also a country has its own culture, its own heritage, and the tension between those two sets of probably competing values, right?
Absolutely. I think, look, it's quite simple, really, but we've overcomplicated it with jargon and narrative shaping and us and them and you good and you bad. And unless you're an exact same image of us, you're not doing it right. So for a country like Pakistan, which is diverse, we are diverse geographically, we are a longitudinal country, we are diverse in some ways ethnically, but certainly we have different provinces, etc. Now, we have a certain geography and we have a certain history. Some of our history is Mughal, some of our history is embedded in common culture, history of South Asia, and some of our history is also in the what we call the ideology of Pakistan, which is us having coexisted as two different nations within the subcontinent, so our Muslim identity. Now, how we balance out all of that cannot be imposed by an external entity which has had a journey which went through the violence of colonizing and killing people with impunity, right? So who is anyone to lecture anyone? So not allowing countries to go through their own journey. And by the way, please do not, I am a big believer in democracy, the right to vote, etc. But I'm also a great big believer in the right to exist, to live, to have access to food, water, shelter. So every country has to balance it out according to the population and the demands of that particular population, rather than an ethos which is imposed as from the outside as this or die. So I'm very clear on this particular thing.
Femi.
I would like to challenge Mr. Gao with this question. So you've mentioned that China has a no interference policy with other states, and that states should have their own ability to dictate their way of life or their existence. But wouldn't you say China's presence all over Africa is in a way an exercise of some sorts of power, a soft power of sorts, and does that not contradict with the foreign policy of China?
Allow me to mention one thing. Before China's extensive engagement with Africa, Africa itself is a forgotten continent. That's not what Victor Gao said. That's generally being said by Western countries. Africa, after decolonization, was more or less the forgotten continent. Western countries did not want to engage it for whatever reason. China went in. China treated every African country as brother and sister, and China really invested hugely in Africa. Now, many other countries are talking about engaging with Africa, including the United States, many European countries, India, for example. The more the better, Because Africa should not be a monopoly for any other country, not for China, not for anyone else. Africa is for the African people. And the taste of the pudding is always, you should not be a judge yourself. You go to African country and ask them whether they like building a road, whether they like building a gymnasium, etc. That is the only truth, because don't be lectured by other countries about what value African countries should have. The African value will be different from many other continents, for example. The other countries in other continents will need to help the African country to build up their infrastructure, to build their manufacturing capabilities. And that is the only goal for China. China has no colonial objective for African countries. China is so far away physically from Africa. Whatever China is doing the same in ASEAN countries, in Latin American countries, for example. And this is a sign of China's philosophy. That is, if we build our pillars of transformation, we want to share that with you. If we believe building road is the only way out, we help you to build the road.
Khar.
Thank you. My name is Carl Jumbo, freshman student at Georgetown University. My question is simple. Are you not being hypocritical, Mr. Gao? Why I'm asking, you're saying that, okay, in Africa, you're allowing some buildings, some infrastructure to be there. I'm from Zimbabwe. We have the second largest lithium reserves, but we're at the brink of losing ownership of all of these lithium reserves just because China built a parliament for my country. So if you're saying that you are promoting the sovereignty of nations, of countries, but you're taking our own parliament away, and let's say the airport in Kenya, for example, are you not being hypocritical?
Let me be very blunt. Zimbabwe is a great country. You had your election several years ago, and the presidential candidate was very much against China. He's elected as the president, and once he's in his office, he changed his mind, because he knows for sure that for Zimbabwe development, China is the main contributor for the Zimbabwean economic development. If you do not agree with me, go back to your country, talk to your government, and check out over the past 30 years, which country has invested most heavily in your great country. I know Zimbabwe well. China has dealt with Zimbabwe governments for several decades, including your great presidents, for example. And I would say China-Zimbabwe economic cooperation has helped the economic transformation in Zimbabwe in building up infrastructure facilities and in building up manufacturing capabilities of your country. That is the truth, if I may tell you. I think that is the only truth. Development is the hard truth. Thank you, brother.
I want to bring in some video from the current Senator and US Vice President-elect J.D. Vance. Here he is talking about American foreign policy.
We have built a foreign policy of hectoring and moralizing and lecturing countries that don't want anything to do with it. The Chinese have a foreign policy of building roads and bridges and feeding poor people, and I think that we should pursue a foreign policy, a diplomacy of respect, and a foreign policy that is not rooted in moralizing, it's rooted in the national interest of this country.
So let's imagine we're in January 2025. What are you expecting from American foreign policy? Let's start here.
So regarding the video again that is addressed, I wanted to go to Mr. Gao one more time. So you said that we're not supposed to be lecturing others and we're supposed to go with our own identity because the truth is subjective from one country to another, right? But at the very least, we talked about the weaponization of human rights. But there are very basic fundamentals when we're talking about human rights, and it has been addressed multiple times. How are you addressing the one-state nation that you are talking about, which is something that was created by us and systems, in comparison to religions and traditions which were by higher-ups that were not created by us? How are you giving importance to one-state nations compared to that?
Thank you very much. When we talk about human rights in the world of today, I think the most important human rights are to protect the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. No country has any excuse to deny the Palestinian people their right of existence, their right to their own country, their right to their own culture. And if anyone comes to you and say, I'm a friend of your country, I'm a friend of Islam, of Muslim countries, etc., but I do not respect the Palestinian people's rights, he's a false friend. That's number one. Now, separately, you quoted J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance is my classmate at Yale Law School. I was class of 1993. He was class of 2013. The quote he said is completely agreeable with me. China builds, America should build too. The United States should not just lecture others as if they have the totality of the truth. I think the United States is in a transformative age. It's launching a revolution against itself. This should be something very educational for all of us. I personally hope the United States will become great again 4 years from now. But where is the verdict? The verdict is still out there. We still need to urge our American friends to really work. And development is the hard truth. It applies to China for the past 46 years. It will apply to the United States in the coming 4 years. Thank you.
Vali, predictions. The next 4 years of American foreign policy will be what? What will the impact be on the global order?
Well, if one took J.D. Vance at his words and also reflecting on where President Trump was the first term and what his base says, is that they want a transactional foreign policy, which is if they want something from China or they want something from another country, they want to get it. But largely, it's a foreign policy that is divorced, if you would, from the liberalism that America usually preaches. I mean, it's instructive that President Trump had no problem negotiating with the Taliban, regardless of their values, regardless of any other issue. And so it was highly transactional in that sense. So my expectation is that actually creates more room to engage at some level. But that doesn't mean that necessarily it's a friendly foreign policy. It's just that it means it does not weaponize, as was said, weaponize human rights, weaponize values, largely because I think many in the circle around Trump don't believe in these values in the way we think even within the United States itself.
Let me get one more student voice in about American foreign policy. Gabor, go ahead.
My name is Gabor. I study politics and international relations at the University of Aberdeen, Qatar. And I really had a kind of a burning question. It's very much connected to foreign policy and governance in general. And I'm kind of aiming this question at Ms. Khar, considering that she has massive experience as a previous foreign minister, which is hugely inspiring. I also love foreign affairs. I think is the most important dynamics of politics. But I also believe that, generally speaking, while looking at foreign policy, I think that there's an absolute over-competition of the world right now, and also there's probably trust levels between states are at an all-time low. And I also want to share a little bit of a personal experience about that. I'm Hungarian. I'm from Hungary, and in early 2023, Hungary has faced its biggest cyber attack ever from Russia, from the Russian Federation, where they stole significant data about our government structure and especially military capabilities in general. And the question is for you, Miss, how do you think that, in my opinion at least, I think foreign affairs or foreign policy is extremely weaponized right now, and countries are just using it to gain significant leverage to strike some blows to other countries. How could we reinterpret or readopt foreign affairs? How could we relaunch foreign affairs to make sure that foreign connections between countries are used to create valuable and peaceful solutions instead of always aiming to gain leverage?
Okay, thank you so much for saying that. Thank you, really. And I think it's really difficult to try and get to the heart of things in quick sound bites, but just the fact of the matter is that the way the world is right now, the hectoring, moralizing, and lecturing that J.D. Vance was talking about, after that clip, I was like, oh my God, I'm inspired. I need to look that chap up. Who is he, right? And you find out that he was a veteran, Iraq War. Now, I come from a geography which has witnessed not once but twice an international coalition which has come to relieve us of extremism, terrorism, and reimpose, democracy, human rights, girls, women going to school. And we were told by the American president, we will go to war to ensure that the women can go to school and universities. And how did we come out of that war with a whimper and leaving the women and democracy and everything at its own because it did not suit our interests anymore. So I think one thing which is fundamentally wrong with how the world is functioning right now is that we keep on going into new adventures and picking up new fights without looking at how did we do in the last ones that we picked up. Now, I'm a really big believer in looking back and learning your lessons from history. I'm also a very big reader of the cost of war studies of the Watson Institute of Brown University, which tells you that in counter-terrorism operations post 9/11, where 3,000 deaths happened in the United States of America, we have lost 942,000 people in counter-terrorism operations. So look at the proportionality of that. And what have we gained after that? So you look at the same study and it tells you that whereas there was child stunting at, now I'm making up numbers, at 60%, for instance, in Afghanistan before the war started, it is 90% now. If people were poverty-stricken, malnourished, 40%, now they're 60%. So is anyone asking the question that the $4 trillion and the 242,000 specific direct deaths, both of US soldiers, Pakistani civilians, Afghan civilians, militants, etc., altogether, what did we gain after that? And what are the lessons that we've learned? We will just refuse to learn those lessons from history. And now we've come up with this novel idea that we're going to try and divide the world into two and just try and extract the maximum that you can out of itself. And, there was this question about what type of order. I understand. I'm just going to say that there is a lot of concern, and I'm not going to come to anyone's defense on this because I think fundamental human rights are non-negotiable. And this is something which is a Western gift of universalizing that. So I'm a believer in the West in terms of that, right? But I think one thing that has gone fundamentally wrong is that if others benefit from the same rules-based order, then the rules must not change. And in the same way, I will re-emphasize that if the same human rights machinery which has been used to do massive economic sanctions with massive costs to others, and when it has to be deployed against our friends, and instead of that we start giving military assistance to the tune of $17 billion plus, you are yourself breaking the order.
But Hina, I didn't hear what would change about foreign policy. What would be the reset? That was the question.
Yes, that is. So negotiation, diplomacy is dead. I mean, literally, that's how I started saying thank you to you, was because I'm a really big believer. In 2010, when I first took this job, I was the biggest optimist in the world. Okay? 2024, I am now a pessimist who worries about my mental health.
On a scale of 1 to 10, where is your pessimism? 10 is off the charts.
-5.
Oof.
Because there is no diplomacy. Nobody seems to be promoting diplomacy anymore. And what does diplomacy mean? That you give way to others also. You have respect for diversity. You give some and you take some.
So your answer to Gabor is diplomacy is dead?
My answer to him is, right now, diplomacy is absolutely dead. And we hope that we can get it out of the ICU by doing some really quick work.
All right, so I feel like I might be able to take you to a route out of the ICU, hopefully, inshallah. In October, Russia hosted the annual meeting of BRICS, the intergovernmental organization that includes Brazil, China, Russia, India, South Africa, and others. The coalition has branded itself as a counterbalance to Western interests. So I want to bring in Russian philosopher Alexander Dugin again. This is what he has to say about BRICS.
BRICS is the nucleus of alternative revolutionary ideology of reorganization of the humankind on different bases. Not Western, not Protestant, not capitalist, not liberal, nor West-centric. That is multipolarity. It is not about to destroy the West, but it is about to destroy the pretension of the West to be universal in economy, in finance, but much more important in values, in philosophy, in understanding or deciphering, interpreting the human nature, the nature of society, everything what modern West insists on to be universal, it should be reduced to regional. It is nothing but province of the world. So the victory of the West will be not annihilation of the West, but just reducing its pretension to the local level. That, in that sense, the West could be part of the BRICS.
Okay, friends, students on stage, is BRICS, in your opinion, a revolutionary force? Can it change the global order? Yes, John.
Hello, my name is John. I'm from the Philippines and I come from Georgetown University in Qatar. No, I don't think BRICS is revolutionary. In fact, I think it only intensifies or replicates the Cold War dynamics of the past. And the reason why I say that is because people are still trapped in between, right? Take, for example, the United Arab Emirates. The UAE was recently included in BRICS and is cited as an example of multipolarity. But they support the RSF. They are perpetrating a genocide in Sudan, for example. Take, for example, China. I come from the Philippines. I'm very much worried about American colonialism and imperialism, but that does not give China the right to step into the West Philippine Sea and suddenly prevent our fishermen who have been fishing there for decades and decades of past from profiting off their livelihood. So when it comes to multipolarity, is this a world wherein we are actually making progressive changes for the better or not? And I think that in my ideal society, we would like to live in a society where there is no polarization at all, where there is no power that could be imposed on individuals such as the Sudanese, such as the Ukrainians, and the Filipinos in this world. Thank you. So that's my question.
I'm going to get a few more thoughts and then we'll come back to our speakers. Please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Kamrul. I'm from Qatar University. And I would like to talk about the segment that we're talking about, which is about bringing a new world order. Like, we have the Western world of order, and we're talking about BRICS now. And Ms. Khar has said that different countries require different types of world order because of their culture, because of their religion. Now, I want to talk mostly about Southeast Asia, where countries are mostly dominated by a single religion. Like, for example, India, there's Hinduism. In Pakistan and Bangladesh, there's Islam. And whenever we try to make a source of governance, a form of governance in our countries, it was mostly based on religion. Like in India, they're trying to base their form of governance on Hinduism. And in Bangladesh, several times we have tried to make a form of governance on Islam. And every time we have done that, the other minority religion, which is in that country, and it's not technically a minority, it's mostly considered 10 to 20% of the population, are violated, their human rights are violated, they are subjected to genocide. Like in India, for example, they have killed many Muslims just because of them being Muslims, for example. In Pakistan, there have been sufferings from the Muslim majority has also violated the human rights of the Hindu minorities, and also it happens in Bangladesh. So when we try to create a different world order in our part of the country, our part of the world, how do we do so without harming the minorities that exist in there?
One more thought before I go back to the speakers. Yes, right here.
Hello, my name is Mortaza. I'm going to Nilan University. I don't think that BRICS is really revolutionary. It could be an alternative, economic and finance alternative to the BRICS themselves to go further in the global south, but it's not an ideological or philosophical alternative to the West. Anyhow, and this is a question and a statement in the same way, do you think that, for example, the Arab League and the African Union are could be the basic structures of the alternative way to antagonize the Western domination? Anyhow, these leagues are not powerful because they are the separate countries themselves are very separated and they are not united. But I think they share common history and they share the same ideology. And I think such kind of leagues and blocs could be more powerful alternative to the Western domination. And thank you.
Vali, you start.
So, I think Alexander Dogan is reading too much into the BRICS. First of all, he ignores the fact that there's tremendous amount of diversity on values and opinion among the members of BRICS. They're from Asian religions, Hinduism, Islam, Some practice democracy like Brazil or India, some don't. It really does not represent a core that would be a counterpoint to Western liberalism. And in fact, Dogan's argument that somehow BRICS represents a sort of anti-liberalism itself is also not held up by evidence. Secondly, to the point that we had here, we also ignores the fact that there's tremendous amount of diversity even within the BRICS countries. And that kind of essentialist view that Dogan puts forward, like there is this one way of thinking outside of liberalism, basically does suffocate minorities. I mean, all the BRICS countries themselves, not only along traditional religious minorities, but along Westernism, liberalism, and tradition are very diverse. You can look at any Arab society, Asian society. There are people who are very religious, and there are people who have bought into Westernism. They're still the citizens of those countries. And so it essentializes. I think BRICS is only important in one way, which is the most successful part of liberalism for a very long time was really its economic model, not its values and not democracy. The thing that spread most around the world was globalization. And large numbers of countries in the world have joined in liberalization. The dollar is the world's currency. Everything, even Bitcoin, is measured in dollars. And the United States has been weaponizing the dollar increasingly. I mean, as we're speaking, about a third of the countries of the world are under some form of US sanctions. And so gradually there's more and more an interest among very diverse sets of countries to explore ways in which they could do trade with each other around the dollar. That's why a UAE, which is very pro-American, or is joining BRICS, because it wants to trade with China, and ultimately it may not be able to do so going through a US-dominated dollar system. So it's mostly the weaponization of economic liberalism by the United States that has made the BRICS a viable idea. But in my opinion, BRICS is not a United Nations. Even the United Nations that we have is not terribly functional. BRICS is not a value system at all. And the only thing that that helps BRICS grow is that if it can actually come up with mechanisms that allow countries to do business around the dollar and avoid sanctions.
Yeah, I've devoured of all of Vali's books, so I will just say everything that he said. I completely agree with. I underline his books. I try and absorb them. Now, on BRICS, I think there's a very interesting geostrategic play out over here, right? So whatever BRICS could potentially have been, I think Vali has described it very well, how it's not entirely very cohesive. However, whatever it could have potentially been as an alternate model provider has been very geostrategically managed by ensuring that India and China are today at opposing objectives, right? So because India is the great ploy that the West has in China's South China Sea strategy as the net security provider and the deterrent to China's strategic rise. So that's a really important thing which is going to come in the way and is already demonstrating itself in how BRICS is growing. But I think the question that the Qatar University student asked is a really important one. And in what I think Dougal said, in terms of, look, I think there's a very high, or the way I look at things is that we really never allowed a Muslim majority country which could have an Islamic, legal system become modern on its own terms, in its own place, in its own sphere, right? And therefore, you don't see great examples of countries which are largely Muslim, which are doing fantastically well, because that model never really was allowed to, or for whatever reason did not become. Now, interestingly, within that context, when you ask the question as to how do minorities can prosper in an Islamic, minorities are supposed to prosper in an Islamic world. Hazrat Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Prophet Muhammad, may peace be upon him, gave minorities the right and everything else to remain as part of the state. Now, because Islam has been weaponized by state functionaries such as General Zia in Pakistan and many other, it has been used as opium for the masses, and it's been used to really create seeds of discontent rather than peace. Now, India very happily took that out of Pakistan's playbook as if it had benefited us a great deal and decided that it doesn't want to live with its secular credentials anymore and has taken the Hindutva thing to make sure that India actually loses in the long term, perhaps, in my view, all of its strength, whether it's democratic credentials, secular. So it's really about how you use a certain system. I believe Islam has been really badly treated by its followers like me and you, or perhaps.
I want to ask you, Victor, and it's like a 30-second response, really, is from being inside of BRICS as China, does it feel like it's a different kind of world global order?
First of all, BRICS is a megatrend. It's a reality. The size of the BRICS countries' economy combined is larger than G7. Now, secondly, when you have a country like Turkey, which wants to join BRICS, which is a NATO member state, that's very profound. I would say the moment Turkey becomes a formal member of BRICS, that's a major turning point in history. And personally, I'm not a fan of de-dollarization, but I'm completely opposed to weaponizing the dollar or weaponizing the SWIFT system, not only for China's sake, but for all the other countries' sake. We are in the Middle East. Lots of countries are very wealthy. Do you really want to expose yourself to this wanton seizure of your assets, for example, and denying you the SWIFT privilege or using your own dollar, for example? That decision will be made by the individual countries. And I would say BRICS, being a megatrend in the world, is not anti-West. No, it's not promoting de-dollarization, but it is having a mission that is to preserve its own national sovereignty and territorial integrity, making its own flexibility to use dollar or euro or its own currency to settle, and that decision should be made only by the countries themselves, rather than being dictated by any other country. When Donald Trump says, if BRICS want to promote your own collective currency, I want to slap 100% tariff on your countries. Someone need to tell very distinguished Donald Trump that don't weaponize in the dollar, because if you weaponize in the dollar, you...
We'll move on the note of the very distinguished Donald Trump. This is the part of the show that we call the Majlis. At Doha Debates, we embrace the spirit of Majlis, a welcoming space dedicated to understand multiple perspectives. So let's take a moment to reflect on our discussion. Was there something that you hadn't considered before? Right at the end. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tareem. I go to Qatar University. And before entering this room or this hall, I had a pessimistic point of view on diplomacy and where it's going. And now that I'm leaving soon, I have the same view, even more, most likely. It's because I don't see how the world will become more cooperative, even when we discussed, like, some issues about the United Nations was discussed and how, most countries are in the United Nations. And even though most countries are in the United Nations, they, as what Al-Halaq said, all states have a potential to be genocidal states. So if a state has its power and has its will and has its kind of capacity to become genocidal, it will be, because all states potentially are genocidal. So even the United Nations in this case won't really be effective.
Imam.
Yeah, my name is Iman al-Mukhtar. I'm a student at Northwestern University studying journalism. I just want to reflect on the conversation that we had about Africa specifically, which I think it's pretty interesting that we keep falling into the trap of pointing the finger at China. And this is not in defense of China. But if we really reflect on it, as much as people do call, like Mr. Gao said, Africa the forgotten continent, it has been exploited and milked for everything it's worth for the entirety of our modern history. Even before colonialism, we had Western presence in Africa. And it seems like this is just a shift in power when it comes to China. It doesn't seem like this is a emerging trend of, China kind of walking in and deciding to build infrastructure to, dangle bait at African countries. Because if we look at the IMF, they did basically the same thing. We have Thomas Sankara talked about it a lot, of kind of trapping African states in a state of need and instability and relying on the West to continue exploitation.
Was there something that you hadn't considered before that you now have considered because of this conversation?
My name is Fozia, and I just wanted to reflect on the international cooperation part. I had a clarifying question, if that's all right. For Mr. Nasr, you said that in regards to international cooperation, you stated that transactional agreements can increase dialogue, but I was just like the entire time sitting here thinking about how would that happen with the power skewness of states in our world, right? Because you go into the transactional agreement with one state having more authority or more influence, how do you really reach a conclusion, or how does dialogue really happen in that with the power imbalance?
As this is the Majlis and we're looking at what do we not consider before, I'm going to hold that question in reserve. Kyla.
My name is Kyla. I go to HBKU. And I think a reflection that I have from this talk is that I'm more and more convinced that respect for human rights should be the universal value that the world should have. Because more and more I hear stuff about national interest and territorial integrity and development. And all I'm thinking is, are these really just excuses to not respect human rights? Is it just justifying a will to not actually respect human rights? Yeah.
But was that something you hadn't considered before you came into the room?
No, not really, because I was really confused on what universal value the world should have. But hearing the speaker's thoughts, that's what I learned.
Right at the back, yes.
Hello everyone, this is Faisal Papazai and I go to American University of Afghanistan. So basically what I learned from this discussion is something that when we are talking about the idea of liberalism, we should also remember that how it can be different from the region to region. For example, in my country, Afghanistan, during the past 20 years when Western presence was there, and also we had democracy, we had election, but also something was missing in there was individualism, because that country was much more community orientated, and also tribal system that were exist in that country. When someone was like in a leader of tribe was voting for someone, the whole tribe was voting for that people. So in this case, we were really missing individualism, which is a core value of liberalism. Thank you.
In the middle at the front. Thank you.
My name is Amina. I go to the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies. And what I've been reflecting on throughout the debate is the relativism of truth, but at the same time having like the basis, a moral basis that unifies us all. And what I was thinking about is, for example, if we have two countries like China and the US, and they both want to build, like in 2025, they both want to start building an action that they want to take. Does this mean that they have the same moral basis, or can each country have a different moral basis and then they interpret it differently, but they come up to the same conclusion of building? And if they have different morals that guide them in their like development plans, would this result in one of those countries to diverge from building to becoming something else?
I have two questions now in my question reserve. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Let me go to right at the back.
My name is Dua Abu Zaid, and I'm from HBKU, architect by profession. Actually, I think the Western ideologies have been successfully injected into the societies and the communities. But the thing that they fail to do is that to control it, especially what is happening in Sudan, Khartoum. And I think that while we're building new youth and new people through education, through technical professions, we will successfully rise. And I think Africa will be the next destination and the global star in this world. Thank you so much.
All right. I really appreciate hearing what changed in your perspective, what you learned from this discussion as we spent so much time together. Speakers, you have exactly 30 seconds each for your final thoughts. Vali.
So this is obviously a very fruitful conversation, especially hearing from the next generation about how they see this moment. So, I mean, listening to them, I sense that they look at this picture as if we're at an end point. And we've had this experience with liberalism, and we've reached an end point, and we don't know what comes later, but that's where it is. But in reality, I don't think we're at an end point. And it's important to note that we're probably at the beginning of something else, that we're clearly out of balance. In other words, nobody seems to be happy with the balance of either rights, economics, or democracy. But these issues are not going to go away. It's not as if there's going to be some other order out there which doesn't have an ingredient of these things. So I would call on them to sort of, as they begin their careers, to think about what that balance would be and not look at that we're at an end point, but for your generation, you're at the beginning. And everything that's happened is also an opportunity for you to think anew about what might be a better balance that my generation lived under.
Victor, can I condense your experience of our Doha Debates Town Hall into 30 seconds? Your final thoughts.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to share this stage with all of you. And I think the world is in changing mode. And I do wish President Trump, once he becomes the president, good luck. And I hope he will end the war in Ukraine, and he will keep his promise to refrain from launching a war against any other country when he's the president. On that basis, I would urge all of us to work together to nominate Donald Trump to be the Nobel Peace Prize. And we work together to embrace peace and put a premium on development and never be dictated by any one person or any one country. Freedom is the most important thing, including the freedom of our own mind. Thank you.
Yes. Good. Okay. So to the students, I think we learned a lot, I hope, from each other. I certainly learned a lot from you, but I'm just going to leave you with one thought and then answer the question that no one's answering. You've been asking everyone to answer that question. No one seems to. I'm going to answer that question for you. Okay, the thought I want to leave you with is that in today's world where we're trying to divide you between us and them, please always go towards rational, logical thinking. What you hear is important, but what has happened in the world and your inquiry and research into that should shape your truths rather than what you hear from one side and the other. Because I saw a lot of that reflected in there was one person saying something specifically. And so a lot of internal thinking and research inquiry. And to answer your question, this is what I learned from today. I think this is something that I've been grappling with internally, both as a practitioner and because this is the work that I do. But it made me really think hard that what if things had happened differently? What if the Ottomans hadn't lost, for instance? What if World War II had come up with different victors and China wasn't a veto power holding country and Russia wasn't and US wasn't? How different the world would have been. So that makes us question all these dogmatic narratives that we are told as this being the only truth. We have to question it every day and find our own truths, both as states and as individuals.
We have come to the end of the debate. We will continue the conversation online, and we are everywhere at Doha Debates. I would like to thank our guests, Victor Gao, Vali Nasr, and Hina Rabbani Khar. Thank you to our on-stage audience for your insights. Yeah. Thank you, Qatar Foundation, for bringing us all together, to our partner Doha Forum, and most of all, thank you for watching.